order for this reality to function the way it does. And I guess we'll get into that, how this reality functions, a little later. But they are just necessary part of the logic for this reality to exist as it does. And it's no wonder that ancient people found these databases that they could access with their intent, because all you have to do to find them is to explore inner space. That is, to explore your consciousness, and you can get to things like Akashic records or databases or a lot more. Although, I split these databases into the probable future database, and then the present, and then the past database. But the past database is all the things that could possibly have happened and all the probabilities that they might have happened. As the future probable database is all the things that might happen and the probability, that they would. So this is a probability-based model. Now, yes, when I was writing the books, I did get some aha moments, which usually occur after you've spent about 3 or 4 days pondering, should I go this way or that way, or how's the best way to answer this? And then while you're thinking about it, the idea just, that's it. And I had plenty of those while I was writing the book, so I count those as downloads. So I guess the answer to your question is yes. I did get a lot of downloads, but mostly I came up with this book just by looking at my experience in the non-physical, which is, by the time I wrote these books, was like 35 years worth of it, and also my experience in the world of physics, and trying to figure out how those two could, be unified into one model of reality.
When I think of the Akashic Records, in the past I would think maybe that's a New Age concept, that's very esoteric. But as you said, the ancient ones knew how to tap into it, and I'd like to discuss that later. But first, how did a scientist like you end up in a strange place like this?
Very good question. Well, I took the first step into strangeness while I was in graduate school working on my PhD, and I saw an advertisement for transcendental meditation. And what caught my attention was that you could do more with less sleep, more energy. And graduate students tend to work long hours, at least I did, and that appealed to me. So I took the TM course and found it a very natural fit. And let's say about 3 or 4 months after I started TM, I realized that I could debug my computer code in my mind in a meditation state just by looking at the printout of the transcript in my mind and having an intention that the lines of code that were in error would turn up red instead of black on white like they were normally. And I could just scroll through that computer code and I'd see a red line flash by, and I'd stop and back it up, take a look at it. And since I wrote all the code, I was familiar with every line, so I knew just what line that was and why it was there. And then later I'd go into the lab, pull out my 4 boxes of punch cards. See, this is back in the bad old days of computing, and find that card, and sure enough, that's where the semicolon was left off the end of the statement, or some other kind of error like that. And that just floored me, because that showed me that there was another aspect to reality that I just wasn't familiar with and didn't know, because I could do this not just once like it was luck or twice, but that became my standard way of debugging my code, and it was so much faster than going through all of these cards line by line and trying to find minuscule errors. Sometimes the error wasn't any more than the fact that the key punch that punched the hole in the card was just a little off. And I'd see that card had an error in it, but there was no errors in my code. So then I'd go repunch it, and sure enough, it would work then. The hole was just slightly off, so the computer didn't read it properly. So that was my first step into weirdness that gave me a sense of reality being bigger and more interesting than I thought. And I'm a scientist, I'm a physicist, and what physicists do is try to model reality. We mostly do that with mathematics, but that's the name of our game, What is this reality? How does it work? What can you do with it? What are the limitations? So I started to expand my worldview around. And then I got out of graduate school, took a job, and within 3 or 4 months, I ended up going out to Whistlefield Farms to meet one Mr. Robert Monroe, who had written the books Journey Out of Body. And he had just put up a lab for studying consciousness and didn't have any idea really what to do with it. It's one of those, build it and they will come kind of things. And there I was, and a friend of mine who was an electrical engineer was with me, and a bunch of other of us from where I worked. And Bob said, well, I'm setting up a lab. Would any of you scientists want to come and work with me on studying consciousness? And, I jumped at the chance, and so did my friend Dennis. And, a month later, there we were up at the lab. We'd be there maybe 3, 4 evenings a week. It became like a half-time job, spending like 20 hours a week with Bob Monroe in the lab, trying to understand this thing that had happened to Bob Monroe, which was called the out-of-body experience, an OBE. So that's how I got into it. And when Dennis and I first started working with Bob, both of us had this idea, well, if this turns out to be hocus pocus or nonsense, we'll be out of there in a second. So we were hard cases. We're both, we're very difficult to convince of anything. That's just naturally way that scientists and engineers are. So it was we were hard cases for Bob, but within a year or so, he had us, taught us how to go out of body, how to explore the larger consciousness system on our own pretty much whenever we wanted to. And you can actually still listen to some of these original explorer tapes is what they were called. Bob called us explorers because we were exploring the larger consciousness system. He didn't call it that, but it was just exploring non-physical space, if you will. And they're still available at TMI, the Monroe Institute, online. So that was back in 1972. And once you go down this path, you don't stop and go backwards or deny it. You can't deny it because it's your own experience. You experienced it. And what we did at the lab was spend most of our time doing things that were evidential because Dennis and I needed to be convinced. So we did remote viewing. We read numbers that Bob would put on the chalkboard after we got into our booths. We did all sorts of experiments, and the results of those experiments told both of us that without a doubt, it was like 10 or 20,000 to 1 that what we had done and seen and reported on could have been chance. So we knew it intellectually that it wasn't chance, that something was really happening, but we had no idea what. So it wasn't until maybe 3 years into this process that I finally had the experience that got it from my intellectual knowing that this was real to the gut level experience that this was real. But eventually I got there. And then when I did and understood that there was something real here that a physicist needed to understand, then you're hooked for good. So then I spend the next 35 years trying to figure out, how does it work? Why does it work that way? Where did it come from? What's the mechanism that makes it work? And eventually I thought I understood enough of those answers to start writing them down, and that eventually became the books My Big Toe. So that's kind of how a nice physicist like me ended up in a very strange place like this. I was really just following my experience, following the facts that I was uncovering in 2 reality frames, one that was non-physical to this one, and then this one.
And this is why the book is such an attractive book to read, because, as you said, your day job is designing, developing missiles. How do you create harmony working in that physical world, but then in the evenings you go to this, almost like Clark Kent goes into Superman in the evenings, this hidden identity? How do you reconcile both places?
Well, that really wasn't so bad. In general, in my everyday work life, I'm just a physicist, doing physics and doing science, and I keep a low profile. I didn't talk a lot about my other work, so the two actually didn't mix much until later when I was working as a consultant for NASA, and two of the people that I was working with, two young guys who had actually it was a young guy and a young girl, who were assigned to, do programming and other work for me there. They came by one day and said, "Are you the Tom Campbell?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I'm a Tom Campbell. Who do you have in mind?" And they said, "The one that we heard on Coast to Coast a couple of weeks ago." And I go, okay, you found me out. So that was the first time that my work life and my private life, if you will, actually came together. And that turned out very well. They were very interested and asked me hundreds of questions, and that turned out fine. It was not a problem at all. But I don't have a problem in working in the, well, of course I'm retired now. I've been retired for probably 8-10 years. But at that time I was working first in Army Technical Intelligence, and then I took a job with an engineering company that supported what was then called Star Wars, or